Welcome to Client School. I'm legal assistant Brian Godfrey, and this is the attorney I work with, Eric Johnson.
Hello.
Some of the people out there don't know that I'm also a divorced parent. So when clients are talking to us about problems that they're having, I usually have some real-world experience because I've gone through a divorce. And I still deal with things like picking up my children at school, or trying to deal with the daycare. So have you had clients call in and talk about daycare situations?
Yeah, and they run into certain problems, and I don't know if you've had this too, but they've said, I went to go pick up my child, and the school or daycare said, we didn't know you existed. We didn't know that this child had an actual father or mother. We just figured that the other parent was out of the picture. We didn't know there was a divorce or whatever the situation is. How do we know that you're actually this child's parent? Because obviously the schools and the daycare centers have a liability problem.
Right.
So what do you do?
So sometimes when you're going to talk to the schools or the daycare, you're going to always want to take your ID, establish who you are, talk to them very nicely. If they seem very upfront or very, very rigid and very held back, it's because they are trying to protect children. I worked in a school district, so I understand where they're coming from, and so I don't take it personally sometimes, even though it's hard not to because you feel like you're kind of being talked down to or you're being treated like the non-custodial parent, which is a word that I hate. Just make sure that you remember that these people are trying to protect your kids, so they need to verify who you are when you go to pick up your child.
Some of them can be a little overzealous and a little overprotective, but picking a fight with them is usually not the way to go because, let's face it, you're on their territory and they have your kids. So if you're eager to pick them up, work with them as best you can. And let's go back to a couple other things. Make sure you bring a driver's license. Make sure you bring some other form of picture ID, and if you don't have one, get one. And it would be wise for you also to bring a copy of the court order, or if you're already divorced, a copy of your decree, and not just any copy,
right,
but a certified copy, one that you can show with confidence to the school and the daycare center so that they know that you're exactly who you say you are and that you really are there for your parent time to pick up the kids, whether it be for a holiday or a weekend or your midweek time or whatever it might be.
Right, and one more thing you might want to think about, you don't need to go in there and try to impress them, but go in there best dressed. Don't go in there all sloppy and looking like you're really lazy and unkept. Go in there very put together, explain who you are, be nice. Go with your new wife if you need to. Take one of your children from a different marriage if you need to. These things will help those people establish the fact that you're a well put together person, you're not some rogue weirdo guy or some dad that they don't know anything about.
And it wouldn't be smart to show up 3 minutes before the bell's about to ring. Make sure you show up a good 10, 15 minutes early because in some cases the school may never have even heard of you. You may not be listed on the school records, which is another thing you should do. If you get to school or daycare and you say, I'm the father, I'm the mother, and you establish that to their satisfaction by showing them a driver's license and another picture ID, a passport if you've got it, a copy of the court order, a certified copy of your decree, then let them see all that and they might actually say, oh, that's good to know, we don't have you in our files, let's take a moment to add you. If they don't offer to do that, you should mention it to them saying, oh, you didn't have me in your system, let me fill out the form that you have, let me take the keyboard and write that in if they do it online or whatever the situation is, so that way you won't have to keep going through this every time you show up depending upon whether a different staff member is there.
Right. Make sure you're familiar with them and that you respect what they're trying to do. Even if you're off-put by how they come across, just remember they're trying to protect the kids. I was in the same situation.
That doesn't mean that you have to be a doormat, however. If you go in there with your 2 forms of picture ID, with a certified copy of your decree of your order, and you establish more than sufficient evidence to show I really am this child's parent, and I'm here to pick the child up, there are a couple other things you can do before you start to lose your temper, because there is a point where anger is appropriate. But first of all, you might say, well, why don't you just call my ex? And that person can establish that I really am that person. You can put me on the phone, you can take a picture of me and you can text it or send it over, things like that. Get creative. Remember, you're interrupting their day. They were planning on getting ready to leave for the day or wrap things up, and they weren't anticipating you'd show up. So you want to make their job as easy for them as possible, and you want to give them as many assurances and ease their minds so they don't think they're about to help someone commit a kidnapping.
Right.
But if after all that they're still giving you a hard time or telling you that we were instructed by the other parent not to let you take the kids, and that's something that happens more often than you'd think, that's when you can say, well, I have a court order. And I actually have rights that are superior to yours. And I understand that you're just trying to be protective and you want to protect yourself as well as the child, but I've done more than enough to show you this. Don't be afraid to say, well, then let us call the police. Don't do it as a threat. Say, well, would you feel better if we called the police and they helped establish that everything was on the up and up? That has the benefit of letting them know that you're not about to back down, but that you're not afraid for law enforcement to show up, because if you're a kidnapper, you'd have to be a very confident kidnapper to call the police to help you in that regard.
Sure.
Understand that you want to make sure that these school and daycare employees are not being put on the spot, but also make sure that you do flex your custodial or non-custodial muscles. Make sure you're letting that know. And then you're also doing this for the sake of making a record. Because if you go to school and you do all these things, or the daycare, and you've done everything you're supposed to do, and they still won't cooperate, that will help to give you evidence to go to court and get an order saying, if I ever show up and show this to somebody that says, this is the parent, let him or her take the kids when presented with this order, and they still violate it, you can actually get them in trouble with the courts so that they'll toe the line. That's only if it gets that far. We're hoping it never does. Usually 2 forms of ID and a copy of your order should be sufficient. A phone call to the other parent, making sure you're put on the records for the future. Anything else you can think of?
Most of the schools, they do deal with divorced parents. It's not totally foreign to them, but they do need to establish who you are. So as long as you're just as cordial as you can be without getting walked over, you'll be fine.
Okay.
And if you aren't, let us know.
Thanks for coming to Client School.